You have, as I listed there, a fascinating list of issues that your work asks you to look at daily. So I'm wondering what it was that brought you to this work in the first place and how you found your place as a sex and relationship therapist.
It's such a common question that I get, and I wish I had some really exciting answer for it. But my journey started actually when I was a teenager. I just sort of knew that I wanted to go into psychology and I wanted to help people. And I think that at that age, I think I was around 16, where, you're kind of exploring dating and sexuality and you're sort of coming into your own. And I just found that really interesting. And so that I know that I was reading books about, our bodies and changes and things like this. And I think it was that sort of age that I got the seed planted that it would be really fun to talk to people about this in more depth and have that be even a career. And so I sort of dabbled with that idea for a while. It wasn't until I came to Minnesota to train at the University of Minnesota, where I did a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in human sexuality. And that sort of solidified that this is what I wanted to do. So I've been doing that ever since. I've been here for about 8 years now. And I am doing sex and relationship therapy exclusively. So it's been really wonderful.
Very cool. I know that I would have had a big head start had I been thinking about this type of thing when I was in high school or, as young as you started thinking about it. So that's interesting to me in itself. You said, you wish you had an interesting story behind it, but just someone that young thinking in that direction and wanting to also bring that to the world somehow and help others with it, I think is really interesting. We can dive into that whole story just on its own.
I feel like it just sort of came to me. I don't know that I was necessarily seeking it out at the time, but I did eventually go to seek out more of that. And so, it was just kind of, an early start.
Did it play a big role in your life having the, early knowledge of the basics of psychology and then getting into the sex and relationship therapy stuff? Did that all help you in your own life?
I think it set me pretty firmly on my career path at a young age. I started grad school right out of high school. Not out of high school, that wouldn't make any sense. I started grad school right after college and then continued on that track and just felt fairly firmly planted in what I was studying. And so I think having sort of that awareness of what I really wanted to do just got me to a place where by the time I turned 30, I had my doctoral degree and I was specializing in what I wanted to be doing for the rest of my career. So I feel very fortunate to have had that opportunity. I think it just sort of set me on a course that got me where I wanted to pretty quickly out the door of studying.
Did your parents have anything to do with it? I feel like I did not have this type of concentration and focus at this age.
My parents have been super supportive, and it started with, I was actually just cleaning out the basement and found like the first sex books that we had as kids.
Oh, wow.
It's really, really old book, and it's really not good. But it was called, one of them was like, What's Happening to My Body? And the other one was, Where Did I Come From? And so those topics were like, those were kids' picture books that we had in the house. And my mom was really open about talking about that stuff with us. And so we just grew up kind of knowing that if we had questions that we could talk about it and it wasn't a taboo subject. So I definitely think my parents helped, and they are very proud and they love to tell people that I'm a sex therapist.
That's so cool. Oh my
God. Really is. That's massively different from my upbringing. It was like shame.
My mom doesn't even want people to know I have a podcast.
They might listen and hear the word sex. It could be the end of, her social outings or something.
Seems like that Chloe, we love you. That experience is certainly more in line with what I hear most often from my clients, is that it was more of a shaming or experience, or it wasn't talked about. So I know that mine was a more unique experience compared to those stories that I hear.
Yeah.
I hope we're changing that little by little, even by having this conversation today.
I hope so,
and
too.
as a parent myself, yes. What is the Gottman Method and how is it used in your couples therapy?
So the Gottman Method is based on Dr. John Gottman and Dr. Julie Schwartz Gottman's, basically their life work. They're a couple, and they started research together many, many years ago. And I can't remember if John had started it first, but they've been working and doing both couples therapy and research and really studying couples interactions for over 45 years. And from their studies and from their research, they sort of developed a method of treating common couples issues and breaking it down into a language that's really easy, I think, for people to understand. And what I really like about it is it's got a pretty structured approach to, okay, here's the things that it looks like we have to work on. Here's the ways that we work on it. So it's a really nice way to go about doing couples therapy. And it's also one of the only evidence-based therapies that we have for couples therapy. There's a few. Certainly there's a whole bunch of different approaches, but this one is, one of the evidence-based practices that are out there.
This is me and my boyfriend are reading this book, 8 Dates.
Yes.
We're on the 4th date, which is the funnest one because it's sex. But,
love it.
But it's gosh, I can't imagine if every couple really did these 8 dates in their beginning of their relationship, how different the foundations would be. The eye contact that you are supposed to make when you do the vows on each date and everything that you learn about each other with all of the questions you have to ask. It's amazing. So, and I didn't realize until we rehearsed this outline with you, I didn't realize that you were associated with Gottman. So it was so cool to already be in the practice a little bit.
Jade, for our audience, will you just say what that book is since they didn't get to see it like we did?
Oh, I said 8 dates, but
8 dates by
8 dates by the Gottman.
The Gottmans.
Yeah, the Gottman married couple.
And the Abrams. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. It's two couples who did it. And that's their most recent book that they came out with. And it kind of guides you through 8 different date structures and questions to ask each other, and kind of goes over a little bit of their research and their methods. And so that's a really nice book. And that's the newest one that they've come out with. The one that I tend to use the most with couples is the one called The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. And that one's by John Gottman. It has marriage in the title. I really think that it applies to all, relationship structures. I think there's some things that you can tease out of that for, any long-term relationships. So that's also a really good one and highly, highly recommended reading.
Yeah.
Well, we're big book readers over here on this podcast, so we will add that all on the show notes, of course.
Fabulous.
Could you maybe go into, I know it talks about in this book, what they say are perpetual issues?
Yes. Yeah. So the idea of perpetual issues comes out of the research. The statistic that tends to go with that is that 69% of the things that a couple will argue about or have conflict about is going to be perpetual versus solvable. And so what that means is that it's not really something that has a clear-cut solution. So an example might be one person is more introverted, the other person is more extroverted, and that creates certain challenges in their relationship dynamic in terms of maybe how they spend their time or how they'd like to spend their time. One person would like to spend more time in, the other person maybe wants to go out more. That's a perpetual issue because it's rooted in more of character structure and how that's different between two people. So it's not like, what color should we paint this room? We figure it out eventually and then we move on. It's something that you're constantly going to have to manage and figure out over the course of the relationship. So perpetual issues, the idea is to identify first that, okay, this is one of our perpetual issues, and then to figure out what are the ways that we can best manage this. And so we use the word manage versus resolve because in many cases, it's not something that's just going to go away.
Yes, hence perpetual. Yeah. That's
right.
When would you say is it time to end a relationship if it seems like maybe you can't solve the perpetual issues, or when is it a big enough issue that you think maybe the relationship should just come to an end?
Yeah, the perpetual issue is something you just don't want to live with for the rest of your life, I guess.
Well, you just said it. It's when you find out that the perpetual issue is around something that you have as a non-negotiable. So if it's something that you decide, I cannot live with this, or this violates a core value of mine, or it's something that goes against, what I'm trying to build my life around, then that might be a sign that it's time to end a relationship, because at that point you're at a pretty strong gridlock.
What's a really good tool to sort out what are perpetual issues and what are solvable issues?
It's a great question. And that's why I like the 7 Principles book, because it really goes into detail about that stuff. But in the therapy room, when I'm with couples, what we often do is we'll break things down into, kind of looking at what are the common themes in the conflicts that they're having. And oftentimes couples come into therapy over a perpetual issue. It's not usually a solvable issue. So often it's not coming in because, we don't know what school to send the kids to. So we're fighting about that. I mean, maybe that happens sometimes, but more often than not, it's about perpetual issues. They tend to kind of cluster around things that are more stable over time. So, and the things that they cluster around are the significant differences between two people. So if there's really stark differences between how you spend money and one person spends very differently than the other, that's likely to be a perpetual issue in the relationship. Or if sexuality is certainly one that I see a lot, where there's desire discrepancies, people who, each partner wants something a little bit different and it's hard to figure out how to navigate that. That's probably one of the most common issues that I see. And the tricky part of it is, that there's not likely to be one solution or one way to manage it that's going to perfectly satisfy each person. And that's where it gets really challenging. And so couples often have to, kind of navigate what they're willing to compromise on and for what and how often, and kind of revisiting some of these things along the way. Sometimes what we negotiate at one moment in time is going to change and we need to renegotiate it at another time.
Probably areas too where we find ourselves trying to change them the most.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
Is that I've heard you say before, that's the place you kind of draw the line or have to draw the line when you find yourself trying over and over to change somebody regarding a perpetual issue, because it's not fair at that point. It's part of their makeup. And change that.
Right. And often I think that we get stuck because we look to the other person so much and look at where they're different from us and try to make that the focus of the problem, is that you're over there, I'm over here, and that's the problem. And you need to come to my side here. And we have so much more leverage when we figure out what our lines are and try to live within those. So one of the exercises that we use, and I think you can find this pretty easily online, is compromise ovals. And basically you just draw two ovals, one inside the other. And the smaller oval is the stuff that you can be flexible, that you're not flexible about, that is not negotiable. And then the bigger circle is going to be the list of ways that you can be flexible and that you can negotiate. And you're going to create one of these compromise ovals per issue. So it's not like all the issues go into one sort of oval, but for each thing, you're kind of basically drawing the line between here's what I can compromise and here's where my bottom line is. And the clearer you are about what that is for you, the better you're able to come to the table with some ideas for flexibility. And usually the things that we're flexible about are going to be a lot more in number than the things that we're inflexible about. We're inflexible about things that would be basically a boundary for us.
Yeah. Sounds like a really amazing practice and simple enough that anyone can get the idea how that works. I was thinking too that if I looked back on my, timeline of relationships, that I would definitely see that although something that might have been a perpetual issue, if I made that graph, for instance, 10 years ago, it has taken 10 years for me to decide to reconsider it on my own, and however that happened along my journey to change whatever that perpetual issue might have been back then, where, if I met the same person that I was with back then, we would maybe have a very different relationship, I would assume. So that's interesting because I think we hold on in relationship, we want to for some reason, we want to force the person we're with to fit, to make this thing fit, make this thing work. Maybe for me, at least, it's like an avoidance of wanting to do the work all over again of the finding and the, all the things that go with courting. And so we find these perpetual issues, or I've noticed it, I'm speaking for myself here, maybe I'm projecting on everybody else, but we come up with these perpetual issues in our partners. We see them, we know they're there, we know we should probably leave, but we still hang in there, and maybe it'll change. Maybe if he reads enough books or enough, does this work, or he sees this movie that's going to change his mind somehow. Why do we do that?
We are just such hopeful creatures. It's funny, as you were speaking, it reminds me, I've been to some trainings with the Gottmans, and at one of them, I remember John was saying that basically we partner with someone and we find them interesting because they're different from us. Like they are, they have different qualities, different interests. There's intrigue and excitement about finding somebody who's a bit different. And then we partner with them and then spend the rest of our lives trying to make them just like us.
Yeah. I mean, but and there is a
So
beautiful
interesting.
piece of that though, where we partner with someone who is going to reflect what we need to kind of look at deeper and get more balanced on. So there's that, but man, it's a little painful. It's a tough job, relationships.
It is really
it's interesting who we
challenging.
call into our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the challenge is really, how do you honor two people who are different and how do you find that balance over time? And it's a constant negotiation and compromise every single day over things that are really small and then things that are really significant.
Right.
And those differences come up constantly. And so learning how to talk about your differences and how to negotiate and compromise the differences is probably one of the most important relationship skills that you could ever develop.
Jade made a beautiful example there where her and her man are using this book that's already part of the method that you teach a lot about, which is great because both of them have said yes to going in and doing some of that work just by saying, I'm going to read this book and then we're going to try to apply it, to our relationship. But why is there so much pushback when it comes to getting into couples therapy, do you think?
I will say that this is going to sound gendered because it is gendered. And this comes from the experiences that I have both with the clients I see in my office and also the folks I have connected to online through social media. There seems to be a strong resistance to couples therapy from a lot of men. And
the vulnerability makes them uncomfortable, you think?
I think it's about how we've socialized men in our culture. Men are taught some of these, sort of masculine ways of going about things, that you shouldn't have to ask for help. You shouldn't have to, you shouldn't have to read a book to know, how to be in a relationship, that talking about your feelings and emotions, there's a lot of ways.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's a lot of ways that we have socialized men into sort of believing that coming into therapy is a sign of either weakness or you don't know what you're doing. It's a vulnerability, like you said. And so there's a lot of that pushback from men who have been taught to believe those things.
And it bleeds into everything. It bleeds into the bedroom. It bleeds into all of the love languages, because there's something about men who, a lot of times I feel like men feel like they can't ask you what you like in the room because they should already know. And then we're left, feeling our needs are unmet. So it is that we, I guess, have pushed them into this box, our culture.
It's how we teach young boys who then become, young men and once they get into relationships. And, when you think about it, there's no sense in that. I mean, when you really pull it apart, like how would you know how to do something well if you've never been taught, if you didn't study it, if it wasn't modeled to you? I think that extends to all people, and this is where it kind of connects to everyone, is that most of us never learned a lot of these things. We never took classes in it. Most people haven't read books about relationships, and most people, didn't have models like, what's described in some of these books that are based on the research. So like, how would you expect to know that?
Yeah, agreed. And the thing about going in and doing this work and literally maybe completely, we can call it remodeling a relationship by doing this work. If the relationship is a house, which I think is part of the Gottman theory. They have the house, what is it called? The
sound relationship house.
Sound relationship house. But if you think of it as a house and you're going in and you're doing some serious reconstruction of this building, it can essentially come out looking like an entirely new, beautiful relationship. So maybe that's a way to frame it for, men and women, that couples therapy or going to a professional is similar to the way that you would have something you need in your house worked on so that it can be new.
Like a
fresh,
car. When a car has trouble, you don't just park it in your garage and hope it gets better. You take it to a mechanic, like you get an oil change, you do the things that a car needs.
I often will talk about relationships as a business. And I know that's not the, the fairy tale version that we like to think about for relationships. But there is, I think, a huge benefit to applying some of this thinking to it because, there's no business that would do well if you put all of your energy into the startup and, got it going, had your launch day and then sat back and just said, okay, it should just sort of run from here. And it should just be this like passive process. And so we find that, a lot of people sort of approach relationships in that way. They spend a lot of energy in the courting phase, in planning a wedding if they end up getting married, and, putting all of this stuff into that starting up phase. And then
That's
once
such a
it's
good
like,
way to look at it.
we live together or we've started a family, and then it's sort of this autopilot that we go into.
The business will run itself. Yeah.
The business will run itself. And if from, different jobs that you've had, that you constantly have meetings. We have department meetings or business meetings where you kind of look at all of the different areas and exactly how are things going? What needs attention? What do we need to restructure so that we can make sure that we're still, the business is doing well. And that's a bit part of the Gottman Method. And one of the things that I think is so helpful that I got from their research and their ideas is what they call the State of the Union meeting. And this is basically a weekly check-in for couples that helps them kind of stay on track with, what's going well, what do we have to pay attention to, what do we need to know coming up for the next week? And the couples that I work with who implement this and create a ritual around this tend to see tremendous gains in their connection with each other and reduction in their overall fighting and conflict, because they're actually intentionally taking time to talk about things.
Yeah. The 4 steps in the Gottman method of conflict. I've only been in this relationship for 6 months, so we've really only had like 3 big conflicts, but we did the 4 steps. And I used to do plant medicine ceremonies regularly, and I would feel the rewiring of my brain on the medicine. And it was so crazy that doing these 4 steps and in conflict and actually like changing patterns, it had the same effect on me.
It's amazing. And I think for a lot of people, they may not realize what is possible in their relationships, because we kind of do this autopilot thing where, the partner's just there, and maybe we hang out sometimes and maybe we get into arguments sometimes, but the potential for relationships is so powerful and so healing and so amazing. But we do have to put energy into it to
you
really
learn so much about
get
yourself
that.
too each time.
Absolutely. It's where so much personal growth comes from.
I have really high hopes for the direction we're headed. And I don't know if it's because, Jade and I have this podcast, so we live in this realm maybe more often than the rest of the world. So maybe that's how I feel, I'm just surrounded by these people talking about it. But it does feel like there are a lot more people, and especially men, because women are always been a little more open to this, opening to the idea of creating more intimacy just with the world around them, especially in their relationships.
Roles are changing. And I think I'm at the very tail end of the millennials, although I don't really love identifying as that sometimes, but it's the honest truth. And so it was my parents' generation and our parents' generation that kind of started, going to therapy and being open to that, because I know my grandparents' generation, it was still so taboo. They would never consider that. And, my grandparents all thought that going to a therapist meant something was seriously wrong with you. And
or
my
you're
parents,
at the end of your relationship.
Right. That it was just this horrible sign to, go see a therapist. And then, my parents went to therapy. I grew up going to therapy at different points in my life. And so I think the newer generations, as we're, raising them, are more open to it. So I am hopeful alongside you.
Yeah. Just on that, my father and my stepfather both would never and have never gotten a massage even. Having someone touch them is even too much.
Oh my goodness.
You know what I mean? That's just such a generationally different mindset, but
it's my favorite form of therapy.
Yeah, literally. But I was going to go into how you just mentioned that you had gone to therapy when you were, during your upbringing. And I was wondering if your own struggles with, I think you've said before, is anxiety was your struggle. Did that play a huge part in helping you with your own clients? And was it ever taboo when you were coming into the therapy and psychology industry?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I feel like I was probably born anxious from the get-go. It wasn't diagnosed by a clinician until I was a teenager, but there were certainly signs of it in my childhood. And so, we would go to family therapy. I had individual therapy, and I would sort of pop in and out depending on, different seasons of my life, which I continue to this day sort of as needed. But certainly when I was entering graduate school and probably throughout that training and up until recently, a lot of therapy programs teach the students that they should keep everything about their personal life and their own personal struggles completely private and behind closed doors. And so there very much was this sort of implicit stigma about sharing that you would have any mental health struggles of your own or talking about anything to do with yourself. And, I think there's an important piece to that, which is that it's really important for a therapist not to center themselves in the therapy room. So it's always about the client and the person who is there for therapy, but our ability to relate to our clients as therapists comes from also being human and not just reading things in books, but also experiencing them in life. And I think that that's a really powerful way to validate someone else's experience and to say, yeah, I've also been there, or I know what that's like. And I think it's with sort of the new generation of therapists, a lot of the younger therapists who are on social media and who are creating more of a public personality and platform are kind of paving the way for, destigmatizing the fact that we're also human and we have some of our own struggles. And I know a lot of my clients and the people that I talk to on social media have shared that when we do that, it actually is quite meaningful.
Absolutely. I think destigmatizing is exactly what it's doing. And that's what I feel like is needed. I feel like that's so much of the press back, the pushback is because it feels like we're just supposed to be perfect all the time somehow. And it's just not reality. I want to kind of change gears slightly. I'd love for you to break down what sensate focused therapy and polyvagal therapy are. And then maybe we can get into some of the ways that those ideas can be applied to sexual wellness.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with the sensate. So sensate focus is a type of therapy that I use with my clients. And I learned it from Constance Avery Clark and Linda Weiner, who studied with Masters and Johnson. And for those who aren't familiar, they made a show about them called Masters of Sex. They were researchers in sexuality in the US in the 50s and 60s and sort of, started some groundbreaking study and research in the field of human sexuality. And so this type of therapy goes back, many years. I mean, it's decades at this point, but they were kind of at the groundbreaking of integrating mindfulness into sexual function and experience. And so basically sensate focus is a mindfulness practice. And for the folks who are experiencing some sexual difficulties that also have a psychological component or a body component where it's not just purely medical, sensate focus tends to be really helpful. Basically what it is a series of exercises that I will walk folks through. And it's something that they do at home. It takes 5 to 10 minutes a session. It's basically just mindful touching and focusing more exclusively on tactile sensations like temperature and pressure and texture, and trying to make that the focal point rather than trying to work toward a goal, like to make something happen. And that tends to alleviate a lot of pressure and anxiety and getting kind of stuck in our heads. And so it's a tremendously effective treatment approach for sex therapy, and I use it routinely, and I think it's just one of the greatest things there is. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't know about it, and a lot of people are not practicing it. And so I hope that people kind of pick it up more and more over time, because
it again.
So helpful. Yeah,
I had never heard of it.
It makes me think of something that seems to keep coming up on the show recently is that we're all hyper-focused, and I say all, meaning this culture we live in, hyper-focused on penis and vagina sex and the orgasm therein. And that idea that you're allowed to not have to make that the focus of an intimate, interaction. it's okay to do that. Like you don't have to achieve orgasm, or you don't have to have penis and vagina sex, and you can still have pleasure. Like that is actually possible. So I'm just saying it out loud just so that it's said out loud.
So important. It's probably one of the most important messages that I talk to folks about. It's breaking beyond like a binary way of looking at sex as either it didn't happen at all or it happened in this one very particular way. And even just the word sex is often used interchangeably for like intercourse.
Right.
And so sometimes I'll even just find myself kind of steering away from that word. And I kind of go more towards intimacy because I think it kind of adds more of a broader scope. Yeah. So I think, a lot of people will struggle with the idea that, if it wasn't intercourse, it didn't count. And that's really a limited way of experiencing sexuality in the world.
That's so interesting. Reminds me of, high school when girls would be like, I'm a virgin. I've had anal sex with 7 guys, but I am a virgin. Like just the idea that we get this idea implanted in our head and there's a whole lot of other things going on in that situation that, we need to untangle, but that's for a different show, maybe a different day. But no, just the idea that we are so hyper-focused on that penis and vagina sex being the thing that makes it suddenly we've done the deed, we've had an intimate relationship there.
Goes into a whole history about virginity and women, and that is a show in and of itself, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That interests me a lot. Do you have any, I don't know, tidbits or something that you just feel like is important to be said about where that all started from and why we think that way?
There seems to be, it's a tricky subject because it seems to go into some of religious messages that a lot of people are raised with, and ideas about, saving yourself for marriage.
Maybe like the hymen breaking.
What it means. Yeah, the hymen breaking. And it's also about, at its root, it's about virginity tends to focus a lot more on women than men. And it's measured a lot in women versus men. So this idea of, the hymen and whether you're a virgin, we tend to hyper focus on female virginity. And we kind of, give boys and young men a pass, kind of thinking boys will be boys. So at its root, it's a feminist issue, and it's about the control of women's bodies, and it's a whole kind of political issue.
It gets into that realm.
It does.
So, and polyvagal
polyvagal. Yeah, that's something that from the world of social media, which I have been so grateful for, I've recently just learned about polyvagal theory. And so I still say that I'm a student because I'm still reading it and learning it. But essentially what it is it's a theory that was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges in the 1990s. And it refers to our vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, sort of the back of the neck, and it mediates or controls our fight or flight system and our ability to either go into survival mode or register that we are calm and safe. And so it's as I read more about it, it seems to, first of all, make a lot of sense, but also explain a lot of our experiences with mental health stuff like anxiety and depression. And it also translates to our sexual experiences as well. So if you're somebody who struggles maybe with a lack of interest in sex, or it's difficult to get aroused for sex, it's possible that some of that could be related to the body still not feeling sort of calm or safe or at rest. And so it's biologically not possible to be sort of in that survival mode and also get aroused at the same time.
Makes so much sense.
Makes a lot of sense.
It makes a lot of sense.
Stressed, right? Stress is triggering all that fight or flight feeling. Nobody wants to be turned on in that situation. You're not, nobody can be, I suppose, be turned on.
Well, it's interesting because some people will say, well, stress actually makes me want to go have sex because it's a stress reliever. So I like to differentiate between stress, the mental cognitive experience of stress, and the fight or flight sort of stress response. And those are different. So you could be mentally stressed and then be highly motivated to seek out sex because it'll help maybe clear your mind. Whereas if you're in a physical state of stress, you might want to, but you may not be able to in that moment get aroused or get into it.
I wonder if there's a difference there if you're, mentally stressed out are you seeking sex or masturbation or something very simple and easy and quick? Or do you seek intimacy in that state of mind? Or is that a blocker as well? That type of stress, is that kind of block from the intimacy that we're talking about, hopefully being able to create more of in the world? I don't know.
Yeah,
That's just a
I think
passing thought.
it's interesting because I think, when people are stressed, I think they tend to go more towards sex for the orgasm and the like stress relief component of it. But there's also stress relief from physical affection and the release of oxytocin, which is our bonding hormone. So I think it could potentially be either. Certainly masturbation is going to be, one that would be helpful more for stress than for intimacy, because you're not going to get the intimacy from it. But I think potentially you could get both out of, partnered sex, which would be the affection and the touch, as well as the stress relief from, orgasm and pleasure.
And you hear the words like sexually frustrated. Like some people may even blame their stress on not having that release. But I was in a relationship for years where I lived in fight or flight mode, and I thought my sex drive was gone. I thought, well, I've hit 30, I guess I'm done with the drive. And then, after that relationship, I went through a 7-month, 8-month celibacy and really worked through all of those triggers that I had to face in that relationship. And then it came like a flood. So,
and especially, with a new relationship, there's an energy that comes from that.
Sure.
And so certainly that can revive libido pretty well for a lot of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you define self and co-regulation and maybe give us some ideas of how we can create and hold a safe space for ourselves and for each other?
Sure. So self-regulation is basically kind of understanding when you're in that fight or flight, or freeze is another variation of that. So when you're feeling like, you're not in that balanced place, going back to polyvagal theory, we call it the ventral vagal state, which is another word for safe and social and like calm and rest. So if you feel like you are not in that place, self-regulation is basically recognizing that you're in that place of being dysregulated, and then kind of figuring out what it is that you need to, the polyvagal theory kind of operates with a ladder as one of its visuals. So at the top of the ladder is that ventral state, which is the calm state. And then the bottom is the dorsal vagal, which is more of the frozen state, or the shutdown state. So basically self-regulating is kind of recognizing what you need and learning what you need to move up that ladder back to your safe and social space. And so that could be, spending time with people who feel safe and comforting to you. It could be through physical movement. It could be through meditation or yoga. And it's just, playing around with some things until you kind of figure out how your nervous system works. So that's self-regulation. Co-regulation is basically something that we can use. It's what therapists use a lot. It's what parents use a lot. And partners can do this too, which is basically trying to maintain that ventral calm space, even when the things that are going on around you might be tumultuous, or if the people around you might be dysregulated. What we can do is we can feed off of each other's nervous systems. And so if I'm taking care of myself to stay balanced and to stay regulated, I'm much more likely to then be able to stay more regulated when I'm with somebody else. And that sort of invites them to regulate as well. And so we can sometimes, help bring others around us up the ladder. We can also sometimes bring people down the ladder. So that's co-regulation.
I'm working on that as a parent for my children.
But I tell you, when I'm trying to navigate my monthly hormonal cycle, sometimes that is not possible. It's not very easy anyway.
Is there a reason why some of us do the fight, some of us do the flight, and some of us do the freeze? Or is that just our nervous system is different for each of us and it's how we respond?
As far as I know, I think it's just sort of different wiring for different people. Certainly also lived experiences and the things that we've been through could contribute to that as well. So, I, having anxiety, have a pretty overactive startle response that I've only started to recognize over the past couple of years, but my startle response is pretty activated. And so the slightest movement or noise, I get, this really quick jump. And so for me personally, that's not from a trauma experience, that's from being a more anxious person. For some people, that might be from experiencing a traumatic event earlier in their life. So I think it's a combination of our wiring and also the things that have happened to us.
Yeah. And you said before something about the 5-to-1 ratio. Would that be part of co-regulation?
The 5-to-1 ratio it's from the Gottmans.
Okay.
And I don't know, would it fit into co-regulation? Maybe. The 5-to-1 ratio is basically, well, actually it could. 5 positive things that you're offering to the interaction for every 1 negative. And that ratio is specifically during conflict. So that certainly could, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, that's a great question, is definitely a way to offer co-regulation. An example that I use that I've talked about before is that when I'm in conflict with my husband, he will offer out his hand and put his hand on mine.
Yes.
And that's
so hard to
a
do.
way to, very hard to do. Very hard.
So powerful though.
He's very good at it. And so
Yeah.
even if we're like right in the middle of it, he'll put his hand on mine. And it's just sort of this
A
offering
wonderful
of like,
husband.
I'm very lucky. He'll put his hand out, and that's sort of a peace offering that, you know what, this is a tough moment, but we're going to get through this. And it certainly does help to diffuse some of the dysregulation or the tension. And so, yeah, I do think that, offering kindness or, reaching out a hand or something that diffuses some of the conflict or the interaction can help with co-regulation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that 5-1 ratio, though, that is something I hadn't heard of before. So this is, you're offering, it's not necessarily in the moment, right? This is just like an ongoing kind of ratio you're trying to keep in the relationship. Am I understanding that right?
No, actually.
Okay.
So a lot of it, well, that's a good guess, because a lot of people actually think that's what it means. They often refer to the 5-to-1 and they think that means sort of in general. The general number it's kind of surprising to a lot of people. It's 20-to-1.
Yeah.
So
wow. Okay.
it's a lot, but I'll break that down so it doesn't feel so overwhelming. 20-to-1 means that you want to offer 20 positive interactions or deposits toward your partner for every 1 negative that is going to occur. And so I know that sounds kind of startling for a lot of people, but it really is in small moments throughout the day. So when I text my husband and say, I hope you have a good day at work, that's a deposit. That's 1. When you give a kiss goodbye, that's 2. When you send a text and say, how's your day going? That's 3. Like, it's all these little things combined that add up. So it doesn't have to be something, grand and over the top to keep that number going.
Yeah.
And so basically it's 20-to-1 throughout the day. 5-to-1 is actually in the conflict moment.
Okay.
And that can be through, like what my husband does, which is put his hand out. It could be through breaking the tension with some humor, although I would say use that cautiously depending on your dynamic.
Maybe just like calmly saying, you're safe with me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Things like
Or
that, which aren't
saying
like, in the moment.
No, or saying something like, you know what, you might have a point. Let me think on that. Letting somebody know that, what you're saying
Validate
is
them.
valid. Yeah. So all of those things are important, even when we're in the midst of conflict. And if you find that you're not able to do that, it's usually because you're dysregulated. And so that's a great sign that you should take a break
You
and
might
just
be
say,
in mode.
I need a break. Let's come back to this in a little bit so that I can offer those 5-to-1 and make use of this interaction.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm so glad I had you clarify, because my husband
Yes.
been like, we'd be living in 5-to-1 ratio.
That's really funny.
It would have been bad.
Men can often feel emasculated just by a woman bringing up anything around sex life within the relationship. How can we talk more openly and honestly about sex with our partners?
One of the first things I recommend is to when it comes to a general conversation about your sex life or the things you like or you want to try, when it's a general sort of, let's talk about this, I recommend not doing it when you're in the moment. So have clothes on, be on the couch or be at the table or something like this where maybe it doesn't feel as vulnerable. And actually, speaking of the Gottmans, they have an app called Gottman Card Decks.
No way.
And it's free. And so if you look up Gottman, Gottman, in the App Store, you'll find it.
That's so exciting.
It is really cool. And so they used to be physical decks of cards, which is where the name comes from. And in there are 2 decks of cards. One is sex questions to ask a man, sex
Mm.
questions to ask a
I
woman,
love it.
and like almost 100 of each open-ended questions to ask your partner about sex.
That is so cool.
So it's a
Huh.
great tool. I mean, I will.
It makes it
like,
lighthearted and so much more inviting than a serious
it's
conversation.
sort of
So
like, hey, check out this
yeah,
app. It asks all these questions. Let's sit down and play.
Yeah.
And certainly you can skip things.
it takes the taboo away.
It does. Yeah. It's sort of a nice aid, and it gives you the language. You're like, I didn't make that up. That's part of the card.
It's not me. Yeah.
You can skip things if they don't feel comfortable. And I will say that they are pretty explicit and pretty detailed. So,
Yeah.
but it's a great way to learn. And if both of you are open to just sort of go through some questions,
Yeah.
you can do a few at a time and just make it part of a ritual when you're, hanging out in the evening one night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the more difficult things like maybe libido or being able to stay hard or a woman being able to achieve orgasm? What about those harder topics?
I think those things, they might come up during, open-ended questions about sexuality. And then I think, some of those things are just hard to talk about no matter how you approach it.
Yeah.
And so I think coming to the table honestly about that and just saying, hey, there's something that is kind of hard for me to bring up, but I think it's important. Can we have a chat? And, I think the most important thing is to use, the communication skills that a lot of people are familiar with. You talk about yourself and I statements and like, here's what I'm realizing, what I need, what works for me. And it helps when we also state our needs in positive terms versus negative terms. And that's a Gottman exercise as well. And so what that means is rather than saying what you don't want or don't like or what doesn't work for you, you talk about what does. And so it's more inviting and it ends up being easier for the person who's listening to hear that.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, those are really great examples, but it's also just such a tough, like, I'm just trying to think of my own personal experiences where I've come up against something like that, where I'm trying to think of the words to use in a situation where I don't feel necessarily sexually energized, I guess we can call it that, at the time. I do a lot of hormone tracking. That's like my other favorite thing is hormones. So I can see during the month where it's going to be like it's on and where it's not going to be on, just by that alone. And then if there's other external triggers like the stress of work and all these other things that come into play. So I think your advice there of just figuring out how to communicate clearly and authentically what you're feeling is really, it's just, we have to open our mouths to do it. I feel like that's the thing. I guess it's just more about dealing with the shame and the root issues that you probably have around sexuality in the first place. That's how it is for me anyway. I feel like my tendency is to be like, I don't want to talk about this thing because it makes me feel somehow vulnerable. So.
Yeah. Well, I think also like doing some reading or learning about how your body works and, kind of what's normal, what to expect. And there's two sides to what's normal. Sometimes that helps us to know what's normal because it's validating. Sometimes it can be difficult if we fall outside of what everybody is telling us is normal. That then doesn't feel very good. But I will say that one of the best books, this is particularly for women, about sexuality is called Come As You Are by Emma Goski. You've got it.
Yeah.
So one of the most important concepts she talks about in there is the idea of responsive desire. And what that basically means is that for a lot of people, and we think that this is kind of affecting women more than men, that their desire is more responsive. And so what that means is that there needs to be something to respond to. So it's very context dependent. And so it's very normal to, kind of sit on the couch watching a show and thinking like, well, I'm not really that interested. That could be really different than if you're, unclothed and in bed and start touching and kind of caressing each other. And then that might sound really different to you. And so it's very normal to have more of a responsive interest in sex versus what we typically look at as more of the spontaneous interest. So just wanted to highlight that for folks who might resonate with that's very common and a legitimate way of experiencing desire.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
We have a question from the Magic Mob. Deborah on Instagram says, women often get uncomfortable with men masturbating if they're in a relationship and they're using pornography, or at least that's the consensus from my friends and I. This is Deborah. It bothers me because I feel like he's choosing it over making the effort to be intimate with me. I'm willing to be intimate. It seems he just doesn't want to put in the effort to be with me sometimes, and it makes me feel unwanted or unattractive. Any advice?
This is a common complaint that I hear. And the issue with men masturbating to porn is usually an issue for either that reason, which is I feel like he's turning towards that instead of me, or it is a like value-based or moral or religious reason that, you know, I don't believe that this is a right thing or a good thing or what have you. In the case where it feels like he's turning toward that versus me, I wonder if that's something that, you know, couples might sit down and talk about with more openness. And maybe the Gottman, you know, questions are helpful here, which is kind of learning a little bit more about, you know, what each person needs. And this kind of goes into some perpetual issues around flexibility and inflexibility. You know, we kind of turn to different things for different reasons. And so masturbation is a great thing to do if you want to just kind of have a quick sexual release, if it's more of like a stress reduction type thing. It's certainly not fulfilling an intimacy role for anybody who's doing that. It just doesn't fit that criteria.
I think most of us feel unfulfilled after sometimes, at least for women.
If the reason was because you're feeling lonely or you're needing some intimacy or closeness or touch, then it's going to lead to feeling unfulfilled because it's not able to provide that kind of role. If it's just to sort of get off quickly to reduce tension or go to sleep, sometimes that works just well. So it kind of depends what you're going to it for. Masturbation and, you know, pornography often is just a vehicle for masturbation to kind of help the process along. It's a great way for a lot of couples to manage a discrepancy between them. So if one person is like, well, I need to have like 3 or 4 orgasms a week, and the other person's like, well, I'm good with, you know, once every couple weeks getting together and having sex, then masturbation's a great way to, you know, kind of bridge the gap for the person who has the need for more of that. I think, you know, what I would encourage is having an open conversation about how that feels. And, you know, the question is it that he actually is turning toward that and not you? Does that mean that you're not having, you know, sexual contact together? Or are you wanting more sexual contact? I would invite, you know, kind of exploring more about what that issue is.
Yeah. And I would flip it too, just so in case anyone listening, because I don't know, I guess I tend to find myself slightly on the other end of the spectrum sometimes. Sometimes I found myself on this end of it too, but where I feel like a lot of my upbringing, you know, was around sexuality was either shame-based or it was based around, you know, what pornography tells us is what sex is supposed to look like. So then it becomes, especially for the female, it's about putting on this show, not about your real pleasure or any intimacy at all. And that becomes a job, you know, that becomes some serious
kind of can
work.
breed selfishness too. And then that becomes,
from on the male's part in this
it can breed selfishness, and we know that that's coming.
So for me, it would be another question too about how to build intimacy instead of putting on the show, and how to break down the walls that I'd built around, you know, shame walls around sexuality, and creating this story around sexuality that I think the best thing would be to go to a therapist. That's just what we promote on the show all day long. But
certainly seeing a sex therapist is a great idea.
That'd be a great start.
I think, you know, there's lots of books that folks can read about, you know, sexual expectations and just getting some of the education around sex that many of us didn't get when we were younger, because, you know, porn is used for entertainment and for arousal. It's not meant to be educational. And so if we're trying to mirror what we're seeing in those videos, it's often steering us in a direction that ends up being problematic because it was never meant or designed to be that way. And it's not necessarily realistic. So, you know, sometimes doing some of the reading and learning about, you know, your body, your partner's body, and sitting down and having some open-ended conversations. I think, you know, when you have those conversations, one of the most important things, and this is where doing some of the work is trying not to insert yourself and kind of take things personally when your partner is talking about just sort of how their body works or what works for them. Because, you know, at its root, that's not necessarily about you. That's what you're trying to learn is more about them. And then, you know, when it comes to some of these issues around like masturbation, pornography, that's a negotiation between two people. And it falls under a sticky area of defining the difference between privacy and secrecy. And, you know, certainly masturbation is something that is often done in private, although there's, you know, ways to incorporate that into a partnered experience. But, it can also become a secret if it's something that's not talked about and not negotiated in terms of, what feels like it's honoring the relationship. And if, you're doing something that you know that your partner is uncomfortable with, the best thing we have is to talk about those things more openly. And that's not always easy.
Yeah.
Right. And now on the other end of the spectrum, do you have any thoughts on people abstaining from orgasm, abstaining from sex in and out of a relationship?
I don't know. I mean, my thoughts are that if that's something that someone is choosing and they're okay with it, and that's something that provides either some benefit or is based on values, I think that can be okay. I think it just sort of depends what the purpose or function of it is.
Yeah, well, and especially in a relationship, when you decide to take a vow of abstinence for a time or celibacy, communicating that to a partner and saying, these are my boundaries and why, and figuring out if that's fair for them or how that's going to look for them. I guess it's just all a matter of communication.
Yeah, it's communication, and it's so individual to, each couple and then each person.
Yeah. You kind of answered this a couple questions ago, but let's see if we can dive any deeper into it. The question is, how can we bring more kink into the relationship if our partner is maybe more reserved than we are? I'm asking for a friend.
Yeah, sure. So if it's something so first of all, we want to make sure that we're not operating off of an assumption. So we might want to kind of go back to that communication and have an understanding of, where those limits are or what the boundaries are, and hear that from our partner's mouth versus what we're just kind of piecing together on our own. There's a cool website called Mojo Upgrade, and it's something where each partner can individually kind of go through a whole series of different things that you can do sexually and click on the things that would be of interest to you or the things that you would be for sure not of interest. And I think it also has a space to put maybe. And then it sort of takes both partners' responses and shows you where you have overlap. So sometimes that's a nice tool because it just gives you a breakdown of what's the negotiable space to work with. So that's a nice tool that you can find just at mojoupgrade.com.
Cool.
And, if not, then there are different ways that we can express or experience our sexuality. And that could be through fantasy. It can be through reading erotic stories. It can be through, visual erotica. And then, depending on what a partner's boundaries are, there might be some ways to incorporate it together and then other ways to kind of expand upon that through fantasy or reading or watching something.
Yeah, those are all great tips. I feel like right now my girlfriends are all in their early to mid 30s, and this is a question that floats around a lot. I mean, a lot. And it's not just necessarily adding kinkiness into the bedroom, but just wanting to figure out new ways to add life into the bedroom. So yeah all that's great tips.
The other thing is that a lot of people will notice that, over time, they start to have more of a routine sex life and it feels, kind of similar or the same each time. And that's really normal. And often we think, okay, how kinky can we get here and how can we spice things up? One thing that's really interesting is that it's not just sexually that helps to create some of that, newness or energy towards our partners, that sometimes just in, non-sexual realms of the relationship, when you go out together on a date, go do something different, bring newness into the relationship in other areas. And sometimes that can translate into the energy in the bedroom as well. So it doesn't all have to be, we often think we have to get really spicy in the bedroom, but doing different things and new things and exciting things together in other areas can sometimes translate as well.
Absolutely. I think novelty is super important. I actually have this weird worry that's, I'm just being really honest with you guys, but I have this weird underlying worry because my husband and I, we travel for our work. And so we're always on the road together, seeing a lot of new things and a lot of new places. It's kind of how it's always been in our relationship. I'm always like, what if we had a routine life one day and it was not enough novelty and it, became boring because of that? But that's just my own insecurities that I got to figure out.
Then you would be intentional about creating those moments for yourselves.
Yeah.
I'm sure we would.
Yeah,
Call
it really
you
does.
Dr.
It really
Lauren.
does all come down to intention and everything being intentional.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard for men sometimes because they don't like to do anything that feels forced or feels obligatory. But if we can just switch those words out for just being intentional, like meeting the love languages and stuff like that, it's just being intentional.
I think how you frame it and think about it makes all the difference.
Yeah. Before we go to, so we always cap the show with a few short questions, but before we do those, I've heard you speak on Dr. Susan Campbell's 5 stages of relationships, which I think is a really nice and neat way of organizing the pieces of a relationship to make it a bit easier to look at. Could you go over what those stages are with us?
Oh my gosh, now I have to remember them all. Do you have it in front of you?
I can bring it up.
Let's pull it up because
yeah.
I don't know that I have this memorized.
And we have editing, so don't worry about it.
So the first stage, I believe, is the limerence or honeymoon stage. A lot of people are mostly familiar with that first stage. The first stage is, those really strong emotions where, you can't stop thinking about the person, and it's sort of like you're on drugs, like you're just very high on being in love. And so a lot of people are familiar with that stage because that's commonly portrayed in the media.
Disney and everything else too.
Absolutely. And so that stage usually lasts about 6 months to 2 years. And it just comes with sort of, a bit of fantasy thinking involved and kind of seeing only the good stuff in your partner and ignoring some of the not so good stuff or the conflict stuff. And so sometimes that can be why we can, a few years in, start to experience sort of this disillusionment when we move into, I think the second one is the power struggle phase, where we start to realize that, oh, okay, we actually have some challenges and things are, not all that I thought they were. And so this is where the conflicts start to emerge more, and that, it becomes more of a struggle because, two people kind of saying, hey, you need to come over to my side on this issue. And so that's where that stuff comes up. And I think the power struggle phase comes up a lot, especially around the decision to live together. And so
how do you feel about that? Is living together before marriage super important in your mind?
I mean, unless there's some sort of religious reason why you wouldn't, I think it's a great idea for learning more about whether that's something that is going to work for you, because it's one thing to sort of, if you're staying at a partner's house a lot or spending a lot of time together, it's another to merge your stuff and co-create a space. There's a lot of struggle in that. And I would say that for a lot of folks, that's where the power struggle really emerges, is around creating a shared space together and understanding the differences around like living habits and day-to-day habits and sort of the way things operate. So I think that's where that comes up a lot. Remind me, power struggle.
Stability stage.
The stability stage, I think, is where you start to gain some acceptance for those differences. And so you start to kind of pick your battles and learn sort of, here's where I have a little bit of leverage and here's where things are just, this is how my partner is and I need to learn to accept that. And so it becomes a bit more stable and maybe less conflicted at that point.
And then the commitment stage is number 4.
The commitment stage, I mean, you would think that this would come earlier, and I'm not sure that these really work sequentially. So I think that they can sometimes...
Yeah, you think the commitment would be before moving in.
I know, right? But actually think about that the moving in might be sort of the interviewing for the commitment. And so that's why I actually think it can be really helpful, because you want to go through some power struggle and you want to stabilize a bit before you decide to make that a longer term commitment.
True. Yeah. It's a risk and a commitment to move in, but it's a short-term risk. Yeah.
Right. It's, a little bit easier maybe than if you make further commitments. So the commitment phase is just sort of, I think the point at which you decide that this is something that you're going to do for the long term. And it can involve things like marriage or having children together, things like this. It could also involve, for some people, that's maybe when they move in together. So it could look like a couple of different things for people.
Yeah. And then number 5, the co-creation or bliss stage.
The co-creation or bliss stage is basically, I don't know about the bliss part, because I think that's a little bit of the,
sounds
the Disney
great.
version. Yeah. I know, it sounds great. The co-creation is, and this is a little bit similar to the Gottman Sound Relationship House. It's basically the point at which you're creating a life together and you're creating something that's meaningful together. And so it's creating, the Gottmans call it creating shared meaning. And so for some people that could be in raising children in a family and finding meaning in that they're doing that together. It could be, traveling the world. It could be, starting a foundation. It's doing something together that feels meaningful.
Yeah. What's great about this is that I typed in literally Dr. Susan Campbell, 5 stages of relationship, and your post, it looks like from Instagram, is the first thing that popped up in images.
Wow.
So wow, you're doing well in the social
Wow.
media.
That's
Yeah.
so cool.
I will say that her model is, I think it was from the 70s, so it might be a little bit of an older model. So I don't know if I can take full credit for that
You're
other than
reviving it.
modernizing
Yeah,
it.
you're reviving it well. Great. Okay, well, there's a few short questions. Like Jade said, we like to ask everyone who comes on the show. So first off, if you could hug your younger self right now, what would you say?
Ooh, that's a good one. What would I say? I would say just trust yourself and know that, you know, what direction life is pulling you is the right one for you.
Yeah. How old were you when you were hugging yourself?
It was probably that 16-year-old who was like, I don't know if this is what I really want to do. Do I want to? I was always worried about specializing as a therapist because I felt like maybe that would sort of pigeonhole me and somehow create limitations in my career, or it was sort of that scarcity fear. And so I would probably go back and just say, oh my gosh, you know, just go full steam ahead. Yeah.
Trust yourself is such a good one.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you could have the whole world read one book, which would it be?
You've already given us so many good ones.
Daring Greatly by Brene
Really?
Brown.
You're the second guest in a row to say that book.
Yeah,
Is
in
that
a
right?
row. That is crazy.
Yeah. How cool.
It's one of the most influential books I've ever read. I read all of her books at this point, and that's by far my favorite. The first 2 that she wrote are also really good, but I think that's where things really started to click and gel for me. And then the following book, Rising Strong and Braving the Wilderness, such good reading. So
did you
Brené
watch her
Brown.
Netflix special?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
I
good.
saw her. She was on book tour for Braving the Wilderness, and she came to Minneapolis, and my husband and I went to see her, and it was
Nice.
we were in tears. She's just
Yeah.
powerful.
I know.
Yeah.
I cry every time I watch it. And anytime I'm feeling like I just need a reset, where I'm like, I need to, you know, get some good energy on what I'm watching. That's what I put on. And I cry every time, even though I've seen it a dozen times. So
it's listening really to her is like just a big hug.
I know. I feel the same way about Ellen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I look back on, like, I don't look back because I'm not there yet, but I try to look from a perspective of, I don't know, what is it, 30 years down the line. I feel like people like Ellen or people like Brene Brown will be people we look back and go, wow, they were really changing the landscape.
Yeah.
What we're doing here, especially in psychology, and just like being able to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
lucky to be alive at the same time as them.
Cool.
Yes.
It's cool to see it happening in real time. All right. If you could whisper one phrase to everyone on the planet, what would it be?
You're normal. And I know that that's a complicated word because like I said, sometimes if we don't fit in a norm, we can feel sort of like we don't belong. But I think that the sense of normal it's like the bar with which we're all human. And so the idea of normal, whether that's statistically normal or just, you know, you're human and you belong, and, you know, your experiences, you're not alone is basically kind of what that breaks down to.
I tell myself a lot, there is no normal. Like, stop trying to make everything fit into a box because there isn't one, you know?
I know. That's why it's such a
which
complicated
is kind of the same thing.
Yeah, it's essentially the same idea.
It's sort of different ways of looking at that. Yeah.
Either way, it's normal.
Yeah.
Dr. Lauren, before we let you go, where can people find you online?
I am most active on Instagram, so you can find me at Dr. Lauren Fogel-Mersy. And I also have a Facebook page. I currently work for a large managed care healthcare organization here in Minneapolis. So that's why I don't really have my own webpage. So Instagram is the place to find me. Yeah,
your Instagram is really has helped me a lot. So we're so thankful that you.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And if you guys are listening, go give her a follow. We were talking about it earlier in the episode that your page is something Jade and I send back and forth the posts from. So we're enjoying that. And we are so glad that you are doing work that's changing the landscape as well. So you'll be one of those people we can look back on, like I mentioned. So thank you so much for being a light.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. She's great. So today, what do you have for your magic trick, Jade?
So I promise you that I did not, when you said Gottman Method during rehearsal, like the name rang a bell. And then when you said it today, or one of us said it, I still did not realize I'm reading a Gottman book. I didn't.
It was perfect.
I didn't realize it, but then I looked down to my right because for my magic trick, I am reading out of 8 dates by the Gottmans, John Gottman and Julie Schwartz Gottman. So I looked down at my right and I saw the word Gottman and I thought, oh, I wonder if that's the same guy. And then it like hit me. And so it was so interesting because this morning I had another magic trick planned. And then I thought, you know what, I'm gonna read from 8 dates.
Yeah.
So seems meant to
be.
You
know, what's really interesting too is that she literally just like within the last day or two has posted the cover of that book talking about that book. Yeah. And that's so weird. And
I read this book today with my partner. So it's
that's
so
like
weird.
meant to be.
And what's even more weird, there's more. Is when we rehearsed this a couple of days ago, when we got off, I kind of like teared up because I thought, and I think I may have said this to you during rehearsal, I thought, man, so many of my past relationships, had I discussed these questions, had I discussed these questions with you during rehearsal, I would have felt so like almost like left out and so kind of like hopeless of like,
oh yeah, you did say this.
I would have felt kind of like sad and like, man, I wish I had a partner I could do this stuff with. And this is the first time in my life where like I'm talking about this stuff with you and rehearsing this stuff and thinking like, whew, I'm so grateful that I have this. So I was like overwhelmed with gratitude. And then reading from this book today about the Gottman Method and then interviewing with her, it just made me like last week when we interviewed with Jessica Evil Eye, I was like so overwhelmed with gratitude. I don't know, maybe I'm just feeling grateful.
Where are you at in your hormone cycle? No, but I was going to just mention to the listening audience that the way that we, part of our process here on the show is we kind of swap back and forth on who writes these outlines and does research because we have so many guests on. We got to really cram a lot of information. So it gets overwhelming for, both of us to do it for every guest. So that is why in this circumstance, I researched this guest, Dr. Lauren Fogel-Mersy, and that's why Jade she didn't know about her primary method, which is the Gottman Method. So just to get you guys caught up, but wow, that's pretty synchronistic. That's pretty cool that it ended up being something you were literally already savvy on because you're in the middle of researching it for your own. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I'd hope also just another sidebar that anyone listening, I know you're like, can I get to my magic trick? No, that's today. But anyone listening that feels like, oh, I wish I had a relationship.
If they felt hopeless.
Yeah. If they felt hopeless.
A year ago, I would have. So
yeah. But that's the thing is first of all, if you're feeling hopeless, we want to like hold sacred space for you here to be able to be here and not feel triggered by this conversation because of the fact that by now, learning and educating yourself in things like we talked about today on the show, you will have one more piece of the whole person you're creating in yourself that will attract the exact energy of the person that you really want to call into your life, who is going to be most healing and best matched to you. So just think of that as the positive piece of all this. If you feel at all lonely or that you wish you had someone with you now to be able to practice these tools. But,
yeah, there is hope.
Yes. Always.
We promise. So what I wanted to read from 8 dates. So the third date, you talk about, it's called Agree to Disagree. And you just talk about conflicts and you kind of go through your solvable problems and your perpetual problems, which we talked about with our guests today. But I really like the way they end the chapter because they talk about a process of how to repair when regrettable incidents happen. And I hadn't been in a relationship where I could do this type of repair work and just sit calmly and talk through conflict. Literally have never been in a relationship where I've talked through conflict ever. And I've talked about how in my last plant medicine ceremony, the medicine said, you won't be back for a while. Love is going to be your new medicine. And there were so many ceremonies where I felt a rewiring in my brain, physically felt it. I was on the medicine, but I felt it. And then just last week while working through conflict with my partner, we did these 4 steps. So the first one is each person takes a turn to talk about what they were feeling during the fight. The second one is, so you take turns, you let the other person speak. The second one is each person talks about how they saw the situation and their perspective about what actually happened. So their story. You don't interrupt, you just validate by listening. It doesn't mean you agree. It just means you're giving them that safe space, right?
Yeah.
The third one is, and also like language in that would be kind of like, instead of like telling your partner what they did or didn't do, you're more saying, I heard you saying, like what it's your story. So you're not accusing them. Yeah. So the third one is triggers. So you can just say, it's like, they're old wounds that came up for you. You can bring up a time when you felt judged or excluded or humiliated, and it helps you connect your feelings to this incident.
Yes, I do that a lot. I say,
Yeah.
this triggers a feeling in me that relates back to when my, dad didn't choose me over.
You're realizing that
something.
you're repeating a story in a way. Yeah.
Right.
So step 4 is you accept responsibility. So you own up to your part. It doesn't mean that you caused the issue or that you're taking all the blame, but you just own up to your part. What can you own up to and how you contributed in some way? You're trying to avoid blame here, and
you're trying to avoid blaming the other person.
Right.
Okay.
You're just accepting your responsibility.
Okay.
And then like in that, you both discuss how you can do things differently in the future. But so me and my partner did that with a conflict that we had the previous week, and while maintaining eye contact and having touch. And I felt it was so crazy because one of the things I realized that I was telling him is that I didn't feel valued. I didn't feel like what I say has value, and I felt unappreciated. And when I was saying that, as I was saying it, I realized, oh, I don't feel like what I say has value.
Mm-hmm.
I don't appreciate myself. And so it was an awakening for me in a way that ceremonies have been. And as I was just like talking through conflict, again, it was mind blowing to me
that you were able to do that.
Yes, I've never experienced it. So as all that was happening and having this conversation, I really did feel a pattern change in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
Like I felt it just like I had been on
this
medicine.
Is possible. That's a new opening for you. This is possible.
Yes, because when you experience things like that, patterns change. Mm-hmm. And it like hit me like, oh, the plant medicine told me that this was going to happen this year.
Yeah.
Like this was going to be my new ceremony. It was love. And so it was such a rewarding moment, such a good moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also just like, oh, wow, there are other ways to rewire your brain. I don't know why it was so mind blowing to me that like I was talking through conflict. I've always been afraid as soon as conflict arises, whoop, like get out of their way or get busy, like stay away. It's something bad's going to happen, pretty much my whole life. But I was going to quickly read through a couple of things that they also say about conflict just for tips. So it says, don't make your partner the bad guy. Mm-hmm. There is no winner in a healthy conflict. I think that's so important. There is no winner in a healthy conflict. There is only understanding and resolution or acceptance.
Yes, that's huge.
So in love, everyone wins.
Yes.
So communicate a fundamental acceptance of your partner's personality, regardless of how you're different. Don't avoid conflict. This is big. Avoiding conflict breeds emotional distance. Don't criticize or judge your partner or believe that their viewpoint is wrong and yours is right. Both of your perspectives are valid. When regrettable incidents happen, use the 4 steps that I just listed to process and repair your fight. And then recognize when a problem is solvable and when it's not. Not all conflict can or needs to be resolved. Yeah. And just to give you a general idea of how this book goes, at the end of this chapter, something they have you do, at the end of every chapter, there's a vow that you say to your partner while maintaining eye contact and touch. Mm-hmm. This vow for the end of conflict was, I commit to accepting you completely and embracing our differences. When we have conflict, I'll seek to understand your feelings and point of view about the issue, and will manage our conflict as skillfully as possible. When regrettable incidents happen, I'll seek to repair the damage through the process we have discussed. So that's just important. A general idea of how Gottman Method works.
Right.
And that's just the 3rd date. There's 8 of them.
That's really, really beautiful stuff. I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Imagine doing that with a partner.
It brings a tear to my eye of joy that we are literally living out the transformation that's happening in our own lives, like you just expressed through sharing that tool with us.
I just can't imagine anything safer.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you getting good at it and your relationship getting good at it is the safest that's, it could be. Yeah. But I love that we're doing this in real time with the folks that are listening. So I'm just glad you're in it with us together, guys. Whoever's listening.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, my magic trick is something that comes from a previous guest of ours, Sahara Rose. And it's just a post that I kind of took some of the info from. So in shamanic cultures, the medicine person would ask some simple questions that would guide them on healing someone. So as I ask these questions, see which of them stirs you most. When did you stop dancing? When did you stop singing? When did you stop being enchanted by stories? When did you stop being comforted by the sweet territory of silence? So which of those questions calls to you right now? That's the question you need to answer. And that would be, asking yourself, what do you need most? Dance, song, story, or silence? And whichever it is, my magic trick is pretty simple. It's just to invite you to find a way to bring more of that into your life right now.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. I like the first one the most. When did you stop dancing? Because dancing just makes me so happy. So
Yeah, if you ever stopped dancing, then I know something was wrong.
Lord.
Terribly wrong. That'll be the question I perpetually ask you. I sing, it's weird is that I dance from time to time, like in my house and, but more consciously, like because I know I need to get some movement in. So then I just do it. And I actually love dancing. I grew up dancing a lot and I go dance for a living for a long time. I mean, like I've done a lot on the dance floor, but funny enough, I sing in my house whenever I'm happiest. I notice I don't go singing out in public, but like with my cats, I'm always singing to them and making up songs to them.
I sing when I need to like stop feeling anxious. I'll sing a peaceful song and it really, really helps me.
I've never tried that for anxiety.
Yeah, I sing a calming song because you're like, I think it's hard to think about what you're anxious about while you're singing.
Yeah, because you got to remember the words and the tone and the texture and everything you're doing. Yeah. So those are just some questions to ask yourself today. All right, fam. Before we sign off, we want to remind you again of the little giveaway we have going on for our Magic Mob. We'll be picking a couple winners each month to get a $100 Amazon gift card, you guys. Basically, all you have to do is leave us a rating and review on your podcast app. You can do it right now while you're listening to the show, and we will love you to death for doing that. You have no idea how much that means to us. And once you've written your review, just snapshot it and then send us a DM on Instagram to @themagichour. We spell magic Majic. I'm going to tell you guys right now, very few people have actually gone through and done this. So you have an incredible chance.
Yeah, we've had a lot of reviews, but very few people have posted on Instagram so that we know who they are.
Like they don't want free money, apparently.
But we still appreciate every review.
No, I mean, definitely appreciate all the reviews that have come in, but I want to give you guys this damn money. Burning a hole in my pocket.
Whatever. All right, Magic Mobbers, thank you so much for tuning in and taking this journey with us. If this episode held some magic for you, please share it with your friends and family. This would mean so much to us. And don't forget to join us on our Instagram page @themagichour and let us know what your favorite episodes have been so far. We appreciate all your feedback and want to know what's lighting you up.
Or go listen to some of our past episodes in our podcast library now. We'll meet you there. Until then, be a light.